The California Environmental Quality Act was enacted in 1970. It was created in response to the federal law, the National Environmental Policy Act, that was passed in 1969. The California State Assembly created the Assembly Select Committee on Environmental Quality to study the possibility of supplementing NEPA through the state law. They issued a report entitled the Environmental Bill of Rights, which called for a SECA, the California counterpart to NEPA. Governor Reagan signed the SECA as a statute in 1970. CEQA's purpose is to inform decision makers about significant environmental effects from projects, to identify ways environmental damage can be avoided so they can prevent avoidable environmental damage, and to disclose to the public why a project is approved even if it leads to environmental damage. Most proposals for physical development in California are subject to the provisions of CEQA. Every development project which requires a discretionary governmental approval will require at least some environmental review pursuant to CEQA unless an exemption applies. There are three main steps involved in enforcing CEQA. Number one is determining if the action in question is deemed a project by CEQA. Number two is to conduct a study to determine if the project will produce significant environmental effects. And number three is filing the environmental impact report. A project is an activity undertaken by a public agency or a private activity which must receive some discretionary approval, meaning they could be denied or a requested permit or approval for the project from a government agency, which may cause either a direct physical change in the environment or a reasonably foreseeable indirect change in the environment. If an activity is found to be a project, a study is done. It assesses if it could create significant environmental effects. There is no set standard of significance in different areas of environmental impact. It is judged case by case. The study is conducted by a local planner or consultant. They work off an 18-point checklist to assess all environmental factors that could be related to geology, air pollution, damage to plant, or even life itself. If the study shows no significant impact, then it is considered a negative declaration. If it does show impact, then the environmental impact report begins. Mitigation is some sort of action that either the agency itself will undertake or require the applicant, if it is a private project, to do. This avoids, minimizes, reduces, rectifies, or compensates for the impacts of the project. Mitigation cannot be initially deferred. An agency, when adopting a mitigated negative declaration, it has to be very detailed so that it is quite clear that they are avoiding the impacts. A further study is not considered mitigation. Consulting with other agencies is also not considered mitigation by itself. Mitigation must be made a condition of approval by an agency and must adapt a mitigation monitoring reporting program to ensure that the terms of the mitigation are being met by the lead agency. A lead agency must identify mitigation for all significant impacts unless infeasible. Mitigation outside the lead agency boundaries is not infeasible or unenforceable if another agency can and will implement it. A deferred mitigation is only when an EIR is prepared, and it cannot defer mitigation entirely. It can only defer details of the mitigation measure. A properly deferred mitigation measure must include agencies' commitment to mitigate, performance standards, describe what the measure will require, ensuring its effectiveness. If the measure requires further studies, it must be specific in acting and taking the mitigation measure to the impact. The environmental impact report is the key to change in CEQA. It is prepared by the local government from a team of planners, geologists, biologists, and even paleontologists. It is very expensive and time-consuming to perform, and it costs an average of $50,000 to $100,000, and it takes several months to complete the whole process. CEQA has guidelines, which are regulations that explain and interpret the law for both the public agencies required to administer CEQA and for the general public. The guidelines provide objectives, criteria, and procedures for the orderly evaluation of projects and the preparation of the environmental impact reports, negative declarations, and mitigated negative declarations by public agencies. The fundamental purpose of the guidelines is to make the CEQA process comprehensible to those who administer it, to those subject to it, and to those whose benefit it exists. Guideline revision is an ongoing process with CEQA. The Secretary of Resources is required to review and consider amendments every 2 years. A public agency must comply with CEQA when it is undertaking an activity defined by CEQA as a project. Statutory exemptions are determined by the legislature, which include demolition permits, adoption of coastal and timberland plans, and some mass transit projects.